On today's World Insight, diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine as Turkey seeks to mediate direct talks between the two sides. How far have these efforts gone? The chances of a breakthrough? And how credible are U.S.-initiated efforts toward the ceasefire?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. U.S. President Donald Trump earlier promised that he would talk separately with Russian President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart on Monday for a ceasefire deal. But according to the Ukrainian Air Force on Sunday, ahead of the talks, Russia sent 273 drones to Ukraine, the single largest number since 2022. That is according to the Ukrainian side. This comes after some rare progress made last Friday when the first direct Russian-Ukraine peace talk since 2022 were held in Istanbul. Both sides agreed to a major prisoner swap. So where are the peace talks headed now, if there are any? What is the stand of the different parties involved? And how sincere is Washington in all of this? It's time to loop in our panelists. Joining us in Paris, Joab Toker, professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. In Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, an American professor of East China Normal University. In Beijing, Rong Ying, senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, how would you describe the result of the Istanbul talk?
We were disappointed to see that Russia downgraded the talks, that they decided to portray them as a procedural matter at this point, despite the buildup that we saw from Washington that it might be an opportunity for a more substantial step forward.
I would say bad. I would add that perhaps it wasn't a surprise, but it cannot leave an option of commentary other than pessimistic one.
I would personally say I think we are happy that finally these talks, the direct talks, between the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, took place, and it did produce, I think, significant result of the agreement to swap 1,000 prisoners of war, and the agreement that this would be continued process.
There are several things in this talk, right? First of all, what level of delegation from both sides, whether the U.S. President Donald Trump will be there, and also there was a lot of discussions about the ceasefire, what is the preconditions for the ceasefire, and what are going to be the next steps. Any of these steps, do you think, Professor Mahoney, have been clarified?
No, I don't think that we have information on that yet. I think we're still waiting to see what might come from potential discussions between Washington and Moscow. But I agree with Rong Ying that the agreements on Friday to exchange prisoners was a substantial step forward, and we should encourage more of that.
Earlier, Professor Mahoney, we noticed a demand for ceasefire, particularly coming from Washington. So the stakes were being described by the international media as high, but we did not see that happen. Do you see this call and related conditions for ceasefire is serious enough?
Well, to be frank, I think that Trump is trying to impose his timeline on this process, and that's not necessarily Russia's timeline at this point. I think Trump is desperate for a foreign policy win. He needs to have something wrapped up this year, well ahead of next year before the midterm elections. And I think Putin realizes that he would also benefit from having something before the next midterm elections, unless his objective is to try to frustrate Trump with a divided Congress. But nevertheless, I think Putin wants to resist sort of Trump's tendency towards American triumphalism. You know, I think Russia understands that the United States was an enemy here, and the idea that Washington is now going to impose terms for peace, despite perhaps having lost the objective on the battlefield, is something that Moscow is unwilling to stomach.
Professor Toker, do you see this as more diplomacy or just political brinkmanship or testing by different sides toward one another?
Well, this can join diplomacy, posture, sort of equations which are unclear and therefore permit some kind of, let's call it manipulation, if you wish. I'm not saying manipulation in the negative sense, because this is part of what one person says to another, one country says to another, in order to find some way of saying something in common. So there's nothing abnormal, shall I say, unfortunately, regarding the situation, although these manipulations and these posture exposures are, of course, are tragic when it comes to the battlefield, when it comes to humanitarian damage, and when it comes to the huge level of suffering which is imposed on the belligerents on both sides. So I don't think that we've had many surprises up to now, in spite of the large number of manipulations and the large variety of commentaries that we hear in the East and in the West and in the global South. President Putin, most probably, if I had to come to sort of a bottom line, is not interested right now, neither in a ceasefire and certainly not in sort of a permanent peace treaty or peace arrangements. This is basic fact number one. I mean, fact according to the interpretation most European and Western commentators are ready to make at this point of time. This has not changed since the arrival of Mr. Trump in the White House. Will this change due to the phone conversation and perhaps other moves that will be happening very shortly?
Yeah.
It is not impossible, but not very probable.
I see.
So I think that President Putin will go on stretching the situation, stretching the unclear characteristics of the overall map. And since he believes that more time is actually profitable for him.
Mr. Rong, I've been reading commentaries coming from different sides. It seems that analysis coming both from the West and also some within Russia has been suggesting Moscow is trying to buy the time because militarily it is believing it is at an upper hand at this moment. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side is trying to show to the rest of the world, particularly its Western allies, that it's been trying to make an effort, showing the posture and also showing its quote-unquote sincerity. So how do you see both sides, the two sides in the direct conflict? What roles can really others play when the two sides are not necessarily thinking about immediate ceasefire and immediate solutions?
What we have had from the talks is they are the kind of deep-rooted or deep sort of seated gap of perception, which I think that it's only natural and understandable in terms of political. I mean, no trust or trust deficit arising from this very complicated conflict. That's why we have, on the one hand, the Ukraine supported by Europe asking for a kind of immediate complete ceasefire, while the Russian side, I don't think they are against the ceasefire per se, but rather they want to looking for a kind of package deal. And that puts, I think, the United States in a critical position, i.e. the President Trump, that whether he will able to play a kind of role to bring them together with I think, his determination.
Professor Mahoney, we understand there has been agreement on mineral development between Ukraine and the current Trump administration. Since then, how much do you see enthusiasm by Washington to continue fiercely the encouragement for ceasefire and both sides to come together for a real solution vis-a-vis the conflict?
Well, to be honest with you, it's really difficult to judge the Trump White House because, it's a very active White House right now. They've got many fronts. They're dealing with issues in Iran. They're dealing with the trade war. It's a very fractured approach right now. This may be part of their strategy. So we've seen them sort of take their eye off the ball in Ukraine a bit, aside from striking the steel minerals. Now, one of the things that we know is that it's probably a non-starter that Ukraine will join NATO. We don't even know that NATO has a future necessarily. And Trump has even conceded that maybe NATO expansion was what triggered this thing in the first place, although many Europeans would disagree with that. But I think, the other thing is that right now the EU seems to be moving very aggressively towards a possible Ukraine membership by 2030. And I raise this because that raises a number of interesting long-term questions about the security of the European Union and the role of strategic autonomy. But above all, because we know that Trump himself is not very conducive or not very supportive of the EU itself. He's called it effectively a conspiracy against the United States. We know he supported Brexit.
Yeah.
So it may be strange that we might find that this prospect of Ukraine joining the EU as some sort of package deal for a future development and security, this running at odds with what Trump wants in terms of his access to minerals, and certainly whether or not he will provide security guarantees going forward.
How do the Europeans see the U.S. role so far, particularly after the agreement on developing the mineral resources in Ukraine by the United States? Professor Toker.
Europe can certainly not tolerate the fact that it would be left out of the picture. Because obviously this is a European crisis, and it would be obviously a very negative and some even say dangerous situation in which an agreement of whatever nature may be reached, let's say in the triangle of Washington, Moscow, and Kiev, whereas the Europeans, which are actually next door, just looking at the situation from a short distance, are kept outside. This is intolerable for European political positions, but it is also at least awkward, strange, abnormal when it comes to security considerations and others.
But how can Europe make sure that is not going to be happen in the way that the Europeans do not like?
Well, this is what diplomacy and rapport de force, the situation of relative forces and relative capacity to influence of the situation, enter the picture. Of course, Europe seems right now, and is, I'm afraid, the weaker partner amongst these four. The four, I mean US, Russia, Ukraine is, of course, on a different scale, and the Europeans, they are left. This is the clear intention and ambition of President Putin, not only since the beginning of the war, but since decades, if you wish, right? This has been, to some extent, the position of the United States in a way which was very harmful and even humiliating for the Europeans. So whatever happens next, the Europeans would try to be within the framework and in a way which would be as constructive as possible. But right now, the Europeans are knocking at the door. Some progress has been made amongst the Europeans themselves, who, as we all know, do not share exactly the same positions, neither militarily nor financially, not even on the humanitarian level when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So the Europeans are, shall I say, without this exaggeration, are the poor partner of this triangle or whatever other geometrical form you'd like to adjust to this situation. And it might still be the situation after the series of phone calls and other contacts between America and the Russians.
Professor Mahoney, do you think the current administration cares what Professor Toker just said about the European stance?
Well, I think the Trump administration has made it clear that they, are all too happy to erode European Union unity. I think they've made it clear that they don't like the EU, and I think they've made it clear that Europe can't really count on NATO going forward. So the extent to which Europe is frustrated by this, the extent to which it promotes division in Europe, and even the extent to which, one of the great risks, I think, for Europe is that the EU, excuse me, Ukraine could end up being a poison pill. In other words, if Ukraine is brought into the EU in 2030, as some ambitions currently hope, then this could create a wedge between the United States and Washington. We don't, of course, don't know who would be in the White House at that point in time, but it could end up being a poison pill where Europe is alienated both from Russia and the United States, but unable to provide security for itself or the Ukraine. So I think in this case, it's a very difficult situation.
The current administration in Washington, especially the president, is eager to turn every brick, meaning all the hotspot issues of the world, and to try to come up with a deal, as he described it, out of the chaos, in a way, with the American power. Now, how much do you see that President Trump and the administration is looking at the Russian-Ukraine crisis and see it as a part of a deal from what you have observed? What does that mean to both parties and to you as an observer?
Definitely, we are still in the process of understanding, of making sense of what the United States, the Trump administration, is up to by so enthusiastically to play, to present itself as a kind of peacemaker to try to solve all the hotspot issues. And so far, I think the efforts has been very much, I think, there, but the results obviously, as we have seen, become more complicated. And specifically with the Ukraine crisis, I think increasingly, as far as I can see, it has now become a game between Russia and the United States. That's, I think, exactly the reason why I think EU and, of course, consequently, Ukraine becomes so concerned or so worried about the outcome of the negotiation or this diplomacy, which I think in the end that would create a kind of a fait accompli that would have to endorse, accept or not by the negotiations between United States and Russia. And that is something I think expected, but I don't think it would go that far. We see, interestingly, there are parallel game of campaigning or lobbying for, the Trump administration, President Trump in particular. I've noticed that the Russians sort of talking points are very much, I think, on the one hand, expressed the kind of appreciation of the understanding of the Trump administration, which hopefully it would leverage that to its advantage. With the Europeans and Ukraine, I see again, they are kind of running a campaign. And by blaming the failure or not successful talks of this in Turkey, in Istanbul, as the kind of a demonstration that Russia is not serious, Russia is, and the owners of the talks, the conflict is not like the court of that. And without that, if it's the case, they are going to now advocating more sanctions, which the United States' role is going to be very important.
Mr. Rong, how about China? We understand over the past few days, China and the visiting Brazilian president has been working on a more precise and updated version for peace plans regarding the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Without going into the details of that plan, how much role really others play, including countries like China? Both have been maintaining relationship with both sides of the conflict, Russia and Ukraine, and also other countries in the global south, as Professor Toker earlier mentioned. How much a role it is there for them to play at all?
I think so far China has done three, things. First and foremost, of course, it's make clear its principled position on the hotspot issues like that by emphasizing the principle and the purpose of the UN and other commonly recognized. Secondly, bilateral engagement with Russia, again, as I've seen the recent visit of President Xi to Russia, and a kind of a bilateral even bilateral standalone, actually, kind of so-called Tea Party, but very much according to press release on regional and international issues. I would assume focusing on Ukraine crisis. And lastly, which is also very much important to work in the global south, Brazil together with that friends of that initiative, bringing together the global south together, coming up and reinforce coming up position that would reinforce to prevent the bilateral interactions with Russia.
Yeah.
All in all, I think China wish to see I think the early and complete and this sort of end of this result. But I think China understands the complexity. That's why its position has always been like the political settlement, but that settlement have to be fair, lasting, binding, and acceptable to all the parties concerned. I think that is the background. I have to confess that as an observer, that the crisis involves, as we have, this conversation, many players, including the United States and Europe. So only those, directly concerned or indirectly concerned in this case, would be come to the stage where they are ready to for a solution. That is something I think why, on the one hand, the Istanbul talks did not produce as many results as expected. But on the other hand, I think in the end, I think it started direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, and I think and it's in some way direct talks between Russia and Europe and Russia and the United States, interestingly, if I can say. So, and the past effort, the past year of crisis, so much damage and destruction, I think enough will be enough, should be enough. And the only thing is that if we can able to agree to some basic but important or cardinal principles of for peace talks. For example, political settlement, that is the most important thing. No use of nuclear weapons, as Chinese has made very clear. And now we are coming to the stage where the process, whether it will be go one step, finish up everything in once for all, or it's going to be step by step, but in the context of in a package way, so that all the concerns, legitimate concerns, could be addressed through this process.
Professor
I think
Mahoney,
that is what we are having now.
All right. Professor Mahoney, your thoughts. How much role is there for others to play, such as China, Brazil, and others?
I think they need to understand that the U.S. was effectively fighting a proxy war here. This is a controversial term in Europe that wasn't controversial when I was in Ukraine interviewing people. Everyone understood that it was a proxy war. So it's really difficult to have this idea that the U.S. is in some way mediating a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which is kind of the feeling that you get from the way the meetings were supposed to transpire in Istanbul. We really need more of a neutral third party. I think Turkey maybe was providing that, but the way the U.S. is sort of triumphalist, and the way Trump wants to take credit for bringing peace, I think it sets the wrong tone and attitude. So I think it's really vitally important that countries like China, Brazil, but also India and others really come to the table and try to encourage a peaceful resolution for the good of everyone. China somehow has direct leverage over Moscow, and that China could stop this conflict if it wanted to. That China has the power, the economic power, there's been this whole narrative in Europe that China has been providing lethal assistance to Russia. That's untrue. That hasn't been proven. And China instead has said, we understand the nature of the conflict. We understand why it's taking place. We wish it wasn't happening. China has put forward peace plans. All of these things have moved forward, but China has not been able to force Moscow to take a position that it didn't think was in its own strategic interest. And I'm saying Moscow's strategic interest. So in this case, I think others in Europe have insinuated that position and therefore made Beijing somehow responsible for this conflict and have used it to demonize the Chinese position in Europe, much to the satisfaction of Washington and xenophobes in Europe. So I think that we need to have a sober understanding that China is not in the position to force policy on anyone, and certainly has a principle that it won't do that.
My last question for every one of you, very brief answer if you can. What should be the next steps if we are going to see in any way any hope in this conflict? Professor Toker, from the European perspective, if you can, sir.
The next positive step could be in the form of third, fourth, fifth parties which are not the United States or Europe, from somewhere else, who may join the diplomatic efforts discreetly, perhaps without a lot of us knowing about it, and pushing in the right peaceful direction.
All right. Mr. Rong, what do you think should be the immediate steps that can bring some hope to future ceasefire, at least?
Definitely, I think more talks, more sustainable investment, political investment by top leadership, and laying out their respective positions on the political settlement of this crisis. Fortunately, we are going to see more opportunities because the season of multi-diplomacy is coming for the next few months.
Really?
Okay.
Let's hope so. Professor Mahoney.
I think what we need to see is a decline in the posturing. I agree with my colleagues that this is normal at this stage, but it needs to settle down. They need to stop pointing fingers at each other. They need to show some sort of mutual respect. This will be difficult because the president of the United States is someone who's prone to sort of outburst, even with Zelensky previously. So he's going to need to be more disciplined in order to allow diplomacy to actually work.
Mahoney, Toker, Rong, thank you so much for all of you for joining us. Appreciate it. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.